Sir, are you familiar with this tune? Mommy used to say my daddy composed it just for us. Welcome back to Inspire Moments, where the tranquility of an afternoon can reshape an entire existence, and the singular note of a violin can guide a lost soul back home. Tonight, allow me to transport you to a secluded park, nestled among the ancient oak trees and the bustling coffee stands of a vibrant American city. It's a place where people stroll with their canine companions, savor warm beverages on frosty days, and hurry past one another, often oblivious to the subtle miracles unfolding beneath the falling leaves. It was on one of those brisk, silver afternoons, barely a month after the world mourned the loss of a woman named Era, and a 5-year-old girl lost the only home she had ever known. His name was Daniel Crest, a name whispered with reverence and trepidation. 40 stories above the city's clamor, he resided in a glass tower that mirrored the sunset's glow like the blade of a knife. CEO, strategist, visionary, these were the titles that preceded him. Yet, long before he ascended to become one of the most influential figures in the music industry, Daniel had been a gentler soul, a violinist who once played not for financial gain, but for the sheer joy of it. However, on that particular day, love was far from his thoughts. He had just emerged from a protracted meeting, consumed with numbers, digital marketing forecasts, and sponsorship negotiations involving banking institutions, insurance partnerships, and a significant streaming expansion. Everything in his world had become a business transaction, a measurable metric, a profit-driven curve. Music had transformed into a mere asset. Silence had become a cherished luxury. And so, he traversed the park, much like other stressed executives, with his phone clutched in hand, eyes glazed over, his heart weighed down with burdens he dared not acknowledge. It was then that he heard it, a violin, its notes soaring high, crystal clear, trembling with an emotion that resonated deep within him. It wasn't the trembling of fear or cold, but the kind that emanated from cherished memories. Daniel halted abruptly, rooted to the spot on the path, as if someone had reached into his chest and tugged on a string so taut that he couldn't draw breath. The melody that floated through the trees was one he knew intimately, even more so than his own heartbeat. 6 years prior, in a cozy room adorned with fairy lights and mismatched curtains, he had composed that melody for a woman named Era. He wrote it on a night when she wept softly into his shoulder, confessing her fear that he would one day abandon her. He had promised her that he never would, but he did. That melody was their bond, their private secret. It had never been published, never shared, no recordings existed online. Only a single delicate demo file stored on an antiquated hard drive, buried at the back of a desk drawer, forgotten the day he donned a suit and entered the corporate world for good. No one knew that melody, no one except, and yet, there it was, drifting through the crisp afternoon air of the park, as if someone had opened a portal to the past. Daniel slowly turned toward the source of the sound. He saw her, a diminutive girl seated on a weathered wooden bench, her feet barely reaching the ground, the violin cradled beneath her chin as if she had been born holding it. Her coat was thin, the kind that children wear for far too many winters because there's never enough money for a new one. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. But her posture, her bowing technique, her phrasing, it all radiated a natural brilliance that seasoned musicians spent decades pursuing, often without success. She wasn't simply playing the melody. She was conveying a story through it, a story she could not possibly have known. People strolled by as if nothing remarkable were taking place. A couple tossed some loose change into the small paper cup at her feet. A woman walking a dog grumbled that street music should require a permit. An elderly homeless veteran paused and listened, blinking rapidly as if the music were drawing forth memories from a place he had long locked away. But Daniel felt the ground sway beneath his feet. He moved closer, scarcely breathing, each note piercing deeper than the last. The final phrase quivered in the air, that fragile promise from 6 years ago, a promise he had broken. The girl lifted her bow, allowing the last note to dissipate like smoke, and finally looked up at him. Her eyes were vast, filled with a sadness far too profound for a 5-year-old, yet also brimming with hope. "Sir," she said softly, tilting her head in the way children do when they're unsure if they're allowed to speak. Do you know this melody? Daniel's heart clenched. Her voice was delicate, but there was something familiar in the way she lingered over her words, something achingly familiar. Mommy said, she added, almost as if making a confession, my daddy wrote it for us. A 5-year-old girl playing a melody that no one knew, claiming that her father had written it. A father who, judging by her tone alone, sounded like a ghost she had never met. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat stinging. He knelt down slowly, as if approaching a wild bird that might take flight if he moved too quickly. Where did you learn that? He whispered, but he stopped himself before the question fully formed. He had no right to interrogate a little girl shivering on a cold park bench. The girl hugged her violin to her chest as if it were the only source of warmth she possessed. Mommy taught me before she went to the angels, she said softly. Mommy said if I play this song, maybe Daddy will hear it and find me. A frigid wind swept between them, and Daniel, a man who had built empires, who had negotiated million-dollar deals without so much as a blink, felt his vision blur. Because 5 years ago, 6 years ago, long before he became CEO Daniel Crest, there had been a woman who played violin with fire in her voice and sunlight in her hair. Her name was Era, and he had loved her more than he had ever admitted. Daniel remained on one knee for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to trust his own breath. The little girl sat there with her violin resting on her lap, her fingers slightly reddened from the cold, her legs swinging back and forth as if she were trying to keep herself warm. She watched him with a gentle curiosity, the kind that only children still possess, even after life has been unkind. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the echo of that melody still swirling inside his chest like a tide that refused to subside. What is your name, sweetheart? He asked gently, trying to maintain a steady tone. The little girl straightened her small shoulders, as if remembering her mother's voice instructing her to be polite. My name is Arya, she said. Mommy said that means a song that belongs to the heart. The name struck Daniel like another blow, because 6 years ago, on a rainy night in a dimly lit apartment where 2 violins leaned against the wall, Era had once whispered something almost identical to him. She had said, if we ever have a daughter, I would name her Arya because she would be the melody we could never lose. He had laughed, kissed her forehead, and assured her that they had all the time in the world. But they didn't. He walked away from that world and from her. Arya's small voice pulled him back to the present. Mommy said that Daddy played this song for her when he promised he would never leave. She looked down at her scuffed shoes. But he did. Maybe he had a really important job. Daniel felt the words slice clean through him. Arya didn't utter them with anger, not even with blame. She spoke with the innocent confusion of a child trying to comprehend why adults disappear. He could barely manage a breath. Your mommy, what was her name? Arya toyed with the edge of her coat sleeve, twisting the frayed threads between her fingers. Her name was... She whispered. Mommy said Daddy loved her very much. Mommy said Daddy was the only one who ever played this song the way it was meant to be played. Era said. The name, spoken by a 5-year-old he had never met, carried the same softness that Era herself used to possess in her voice. Daniel had to avert his gaze. The sky appeared blurry for a moment, as if the cold wind had seeped into his eyes. 1,000 memories surged through him. The cramped living space where they shared noodles and cheap wine. The candlelight nights when they played violin until sunrise. The long conversations about traveling from city to city performing together. The night she wept because she feared losing him. The night he made the promise he couldn't keep. And now, here was a little girl, the age a child would be if Era had been pregnant after he left, playing their melody with the hands of someone born to carry it. Daniel's breath trembled. He wanted to speak, to ask the questions hammering inside his mind. Where do you live? Who takes care of you now? Did your mother ever tell you anything? Anything about him? Anything about me? But he stopped himself. The child was trembling, and not from fear, but from cold. Her coat was too thin, her small hands were stiff, the temperature was dropping, and she had been sitting there playing her heart out for strangers who barely stopped long enough to listen. Daniel shrugged off his wool scarf and gently wrapped it around her shoulders. She froze at first, as if she wasn't accustomed to anyone doing something nice for her. Then she lowered her chin into the warmth as if she hadn't felt it in a long time. "Thank you, sir," she murmured. Her gratitude was too mature for her age, the kind of gratitude children only learn when they are forced to appreciate things they should have had without asking. Before Daniel could say anything else, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you again with that violin." A park security guard approached them, irritation evident in his every step. He was a tall man in a fluorescent vest, the kind who treated rules like weapons. "You cannot be out here begging for money, kid. We told you last week. If you want to play music, join a school program or something. This is not a stage." Arya shrank instantly, curling her shoulders inward. Her bow nearly slipped from her hand. Daniel stood up so quickly that the guard stopped mid-step. "She is not begging," Daniel said, his voice colder than the wind. "She is playing music." The guard scoffed. "Whatever she calls it, it's still not allowed. People are complaining." Some woman with a stroller said she felt uncomfortable. Daniel exhaled slowly, another reminder of how the world treated small, fragile things when they didn't come wrapped in wealth. He softened his tone, not wanting to frighten Arya. "Sir, it's cold. Let the child finish and go home." The guard rolled his eyes but backed off with a warning gesture. "Fine, 10 more minutes. But if I see her again tomorrow, I'll call the police or social services or whatever." Arya looked mortified, as if she had done something wrong. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't want to make trouble. Mommy said if I play this song, maybe Daddy will find me. I thought maybe today." Daniel knelt again so their eyes were level. "Arya," he said quietly, "do you always come here alone?" She shook her head. "No, Aunt Mara brings me, but she said she needs to go talk to some people today, grown-up stuff. She said I should keep playing so people put money in the cup. She said every little bit helps." Something darkened in Daniel's chest. This wasn't just a child playing from the heart. It was survival. And suddenly he realized how long Arya must have been out in the cold. How many days she had been sitting there. How many adults had walked past her and done nothing. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. A pull, a responsibility he didn't fully understand yet, but could no longer ignore. Arya looked up at him again, her eyes soft and brave. "Sir, you looked like you knew the song." For a long moment Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because every part of him was beginning to understand something impossible, something terrifying, something beautiful. He rose slowly, staring at the small girl who played a melody only he and Era once knew. In that cold American park, under the fading afternoon light, Daniel Crest, the man who thought he could bury his past, realized something that would change everything. He had just met the living echo of the greatest mistake he had ever made. The sky dimmed into that pale winter gray that settles over the city long before the sun actually sets. Daniel watched Arya pack her violin with careful little hands, as if the instrument were the last fragile piece of her life she still trusted. She tucked it into a case that had once been beautiful, but years of use had worn the edges thin. The zipper stuck halfway, and she tugged it gently until it closed. "I need to go home now, sir," she said softly. "Aunt Marla gets upset if I'm late." Those words lingered in the cold air longer than the music had. Daniel wanted to offer to walk her home. He wanted to ask who Aunt Mara was. He wanted to ask why a 5-year-old child was out alone for hours in the cold, depending on loose change from strangers. But Arya lifted her violin case with both hands, and her thin arms shook slightly under the weight. She started walking out of the park, each step slow and careful, as if she'd learned the hard way that falling meant nobody would be there to pick her up. Daniel followed at a distance, not close enough to frighten her, just close enough to keep her safe. The wind pushed against Arya's coat, making the fabric ripple like a worn flag. Cars passed with their headlights on, splashing reflections on the wet pavement. People brushed by her without seeing her, the way adults often do with children who do not belong to them. Arya crossed the street with the confidence of someone who had learned how to look both ways because no one else would do it for her. Her small boots tapped against the concrete as she walked into an older part of the neighborhood, where paint peeled from windowsills and mailboxes leaned from years of neglect. Daniel hesitated as she approached a tall, crumbling apartment building, brick walls streaked with water stains, a broken light flickering above the entrance, the kind of place people pass quickly at night. Arya pushed the heavy door with both hands. It scraped open only halfway. She squeezed through. Inside, the hallway smelled of dust and old carpet, warmed by the hum of an overworked heater. The fluorescent lights flickered with that tired buzz found in buildings that hadn't seen maintenance funding in years. Arya trudged up 2 flights of stairs, struggling with each step, but refusing to stop. Daniel watched through the partly open lobby door, heart twisting as he saw her disappear around a corner. He knew he shouldn't follow. He had no right to intrude. But something inside him, something deeper than curiosity, something older than responsibility, wouldn't let him walk away. He waited in the cold until the door swung open again. A woman stomped out, talking loudly on her phone. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a stained jacket, her hair pulled into a messy bun that looked like she hadn't slept well in days. She waved her free hand angrily as she argued. "No, I told you I'll pay next week. Just give me 2 more days. I said 2 days. What part of that don't you understand? 2 days. I'll get the money. I've got this kid playing violin. People throw cash at her. I'll handle it." Daniel's stomach dropped. Aunt Mara. She was too busy yelling to notice him standing nearby. She marched toward the corner store, muttering curses under her breath. Daniel waited until she was gone before stepping closer to the building again. Something inside him tightened: fear, anger, guilt. He wasn't sure which hit hardest. Upstairs, behind a thin apartment door, Arya's voice faintly drifted into the hallway as she practiced, soft, wavering, as if she were trying to fill the empty space where her mother's voice used to be. Inside that cramped apartment, life was nothing like the one she'd had before. It used to be different. Arya remembered it the way small children remember happy things. Warm, blurry, wrapped in safety. Back when her mother was alive, they had shared a studio apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and old violin rosin. Their walls were covered with sheet music pinned like decorations. Evenings were quiet but full of light, a single lamp glowing golden, Era humming under her breath while cooking simple meals, Arya drawing little notes on scrap paper. They didn't have much, but everything felt gentle. Now the apartment felt colder, not because of the weather, but because kindness had gone missing. Arya tiptoed around the cluttered living room, careful not to make noise. Unpaid bills were scattered on the coffee table. Empty snack bags overflowed a trash bin. A television flickered silently with the bright colors of daytime talk shows. There was no melody in this home now, no warmth, just a 5-year-old and a woman drowning under her own life. Arya set her violin down on the only clean chair in the room. She quietly picked up the coins and crumpled bills she had earned in the park and placed them in an old cookie tin. The tin was almost empty. Aunt Mara had taken most of the money last week. She said it was for groceries, but the fridge stayed empty. Arya whispered softly to herself, the way she always did before bed. "Mommy, I tried hard today. I hope Daddy heard me. I hope he's coming." And that whisper was enough to crumble something inside Daniel. He stepped back from the doorway, shaken by everything he'd seen and everything he realized he had never known. He hadn't made himself a father, but life had made him one anyway. And somewhere between the notes of that melody and the sight of a child struggling up those stairs, he felt something growing inside him, a responsibility that was no longer optional. That night, as he finally walked away from the apartment building, Daniel Crest, a man accustomed to controlling entire empires, realized he could no longer control the one thing that mattered most. His heart had already chosen, and it had chosen her. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay in his penthouse, surrounded by quiet marble floors and soft lighting, the skyline glittering through the windows like 1,000 indifferent stars. Normally, this kind of silence was comfort to him, a reminder that he had built a life far away from the chaos of performing, far away from the noise of his past. But tonight, the silence felt empty. Every time he closed his eyes, He saw a 5-year-old girl climbing cracked apartment steps with a violin that was too heavy for her small hands. He saw her shoulders hunched under a coat that didn't keep out the cold. He heard that little whisper she'd said to the empty room. "Mommy, I tried hard today. I hope Daddy heard me." He pressed his palms against his face, because he had heard her and he couldn't unhear her. When morning came, the city buzzed with the usual rhythm. Traffic humming, office buildings waking up, delivery trucks unloading. Daniel arrived at his headquarters earlier than usual, walking into the elevator with a posture that made employees straighten nervously as he passed. But Jenna, his longtime assistant, noticed something no one else had. His eyes looked older. She followed him into his office, closing the door behind her. She didn't speak right away. She knew him well enough to wait until he let the truth rise on its own. At last, Daniel exhaled heavily. "I need you to look someone up for me." Her brows lifted slightly. "Who?" He paused a long moment, as if saying the name aloud made it more real. "Era Rivers." Jenna blinked, surprised. "That is a name I haven't heard in years. Wasn't she the violinist you knew back when you were still performing?" Daniel nodded slowly. There was no point hiding it anymore. His past had found him. Jenna turned to her computer, fingers tapping quickly. Files from years ago flashed across the screen, old performance programs, outdated emails, unsigned contracts. There was a digital archive from nearly 6 years back, a recording request, an invitation to collaborate, several drafts of a contract offering a position in a corporate ensemble. She had turned all of them down. "There is something else here," Jenna murmured. "One audio file not public. Looks like a test server backup from before you left the performing circuit." Daniel's pulse spiked. "Open it," he said quietly. The speakers crackled. Then a melody filled the office, warm, tender, unmistakable. It was the same melody Arya had played in the park. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes closing as the music washed over him. He remembered the night he recorded it, the glow of old string lights, the way Era sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing at something he had said, bow balanced loosely between her fingers. He remembered saying softly into her hair, "This is our promise." He had forgotten how fragile that promise sounded when spoken out loud. Jenna studied his face with concern. "Daniel, are you all right?" He swallowed. Where was this backup stored?" "On the company's old test server." She replied, "It has not been touched in years. So no one could have downloaded it. No one could have used it unless Era had kept her own copy, and Arya had played it flawlessly." Daniel rubbed a shaking hand over his mouth. "Jenna, find everything you can about Era. Anything recent?" Jenna hesitated. "Daniel, her obituary is here." Daniel froze. The words felt like a cold blade sliding between his ribs. The obituary was simple, almost painfully so. Era Rivers, beloved mother, musician, passed away 1 month ago. 1 month. The same month Arya started playing in the park alone. Daniel pushed away from the desk, pacing toward the window as his heart pounded hard enough to shake him. Jenna stepped closer. "Is that little girl you told security to keep an eye on? Does she have something to do with this?" Daniel hesitated only a second. "She played the melody I wrote for Era, the one no one else knew. And she said her mother taught her. Said her father wrote it for them." The realization in Jenna's eyes was immediate. "Oh my God." Daniel didn't answer. The truth was too heavy to say out loud. He spent the next hour giving quiet instructions to Jenna. Not commands, not orders, but please find out which route Arya takes home. Check nearby stores or buildings for security cameras. Match times and locations. Do it discreetly. He didn't want to frighten the child. He didn't want to attract media attention. He just needed to know she was safe. By noon, Jenna rushed into the office again. "Daniel, we found her." They watched the grainy camera footage together. Arya walking home through cold streets, carrying her violin case. Then another angle from a corner store camera showed Mara yanking Arya by the arm, scolding her for not earning enough. Daniel, his fists clenched involuntarily. A primal urge surged within him, a fierce desire to barge into that dilapidated apartment, scoop Arya into his arms, and declare that she would never again have to endure the biting cold. He envisioned shielding her from any future callous hands that dared to yank her delicate arm. But he fought the impulse, inhaling deeply to regain control. This involved a child, a vulnerable being. He couldn't afford to act rashly, fueled by raw emotion. He had a responsibility to Arya, a duty to navigate this situation with careful consideration and do what was right for her. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, he found himself drawn back to the park, his footsteps guided by an invisible force. And there she was, Arya, perched on the same weathered wooden bench, her precious violin nestled gently in her lap. Her small hands trembled, not from the lingering fear of mistreatment, but from the gnawing pangs of hunger. She seemed smaller today, somehow, as if the immense weight of her young life had pressed her further into the worn wood of the bench. When she looked up and saw him approaching, her eyes lit up with a flicker of recognition, a warmth he felt he didn't quite deserve. "Sir, you came back." He approached her cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a fragile bird, fearing that any sudden movement might shatter its delicate form. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, the worn wood creaking softly under his weight. "Arya?" he asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you eat anything today?" She shook her head once, a silent gesture of almost unbearable shame. "No. Aunt Mara said I should wait until she gets home." Daniel closed his eyes for only a brief moment, just long enough to steel his resolve against the rising tide of anger and sorrow. He opened them again, his gaze fixed on Arya's pale face. "Would you like something warm to drink?" Arya hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his, then nodded shyly, a barely perceptible movement of her head. A few minutes later, he returned from the nearby coffee cart, his hands carefully cradling a steaming cup of hot chocolate. It was the real kind, thick and rich, with a sweetness that lingered on the tongue, a far cry from the watery, artificial mixes that children in underprivileged homes were often accustomed to. Arya wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth radiate through her chilled fingers. She took a tiny sip, her eyes fluttering closed as if the warmth reached someplace deeper than her stomach, thawing the icy grip of hunger and despair that had taken root within her. Daniel watched her, his heart aching with a profound sense of empathy. He observed the way she huddled in on herself, seeking refuge from the relentless cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. He noticed the way she guarded her violin, clutching it as if it were her only lifeline in a turbulent sea. And he saw the way she looked up at strangers with a fragile hope, a hope that she dared not voice aloud, a hope that had been bruised and battered by the harsh realities of her young life. And in that moment, something crystallized within him, a realization so stark and clear that it resonated through his entire being. He understood, with a certainty that pierced his soul, that he had already failed her once, unknowingly, by remaining absent from her life. He vowed to himself, in the silent chambers of his heart, that he would not fail her again. He knew that the next step, approaching Mara, confronting the truth head-on, would not be easy. It would likely be fraught with challenges and complications. But he was ready. He was prepared to face whatever obstacles lay ahead, because this child, with her mother's artistic hands and a spirit that mirrored his own stubborn resilience, had pulled him back into a promise he thought he'd buried forever. A promise etched not in ink, but in a melody, a haunting tune that only the three of them had ever known. The next afternoon, long before the sky began to dim, Daniel found himself standing across the street from the old apartment building. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flickering, unreliable light above the entrance, a beacon of false hope in the gathering gloom. He watched as people hurried past, their faces etched with their own worries and concerns, oblivious to the little world of pain and survival that existed within those crumbling walls. He wasn't sure what he would say when he confronted Mara. He wasn't even sure what right he had to interfere in their lives. All he knew, with unwavering conviction, was that a 5-year-old child should not be carrying the immense weight he had seen reflected in Arya's eyes. He took a deep breath, steeled his resolve, and crossed the street. As he stepped inside the lobby, The familiar, musty smell of old carpet and mildew assaulted his senses, a grim reminder of the poverty and neglect that permeated this place. The muffled sound of a television blared from behind a closed door, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows on the peeling wallpaper. 2 floors above, a baby wailed, its cries echoing through the stairwell. Someone shouted at a dog to stop barking, the harsh command laced with frustration and despair. This building wasn't dangerous in the obvious, dramatic way. It was dangerous in a quieter, more insidious way, the way poverty slowly erodes the spirit, chipping away at hope and resilience, little by little, until nothing is left but a hollow shell. On the 2nd floor, he found the door that Arya had disappeared behind the night before. He raised his hand to knock, his knuckles hovering just above the peeling paint. But before he could make contact, voices erupted from within. A woman's voice, loud, frustrated, and sharp, Mara. And then, Arya's softer voice, apologetic, frightened, too practiced in fear for a child her age. I tried, Aunt Mara. I really did. But people didn't stop today. Not enough, Mara snapped, her voice laced with impatience and anger. Not nearly enough. Do you think money grows on trees? I need that cash, Arya. You hear me? You need to pull your weight around here. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine, a wave of revulsion washing over him. A child. A 5-year-old child was being asked to pull her weight, to shoulder responsibilities that were far beyond her years. Without conscious thought, he pushed the door open, the force of his action sending it crashing against the wall. Mara whipped around, her eyes wide with surprise and anger. Who are? She straightened quickly, smoothing down her jacket with a self-conscious gesture, as if she had suddenly remembered that she was supposed to appear respectable. Arya stood near the couch, clutching her violin case tightly to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. When she saw Daniel, a wave of relief washed over her face so powerfully that it nearly broke him. Sir, she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. Mara's eyes darted back and forth between them, her expression a mixture of suspicion and calculation. Can I help you? Daniel forced himself to breathe evenly, to maintain a calm facade despite the turmoil raging within him. My name is Daniel. I met Arya in the park yesterday. I wanted to speak with you privately. Her gaze sharpened, her suspicion deepening, but he also detected a flicker of something else in her eyes, a glimmer of self-interest. About what? About Arya's music, he said gently, choosing his words with care. I work in the music industry. Mara's entire posture shifted, her demeanor transforming in an instant. Music industry? Her tone changed completely, becoming syrupy, sweet, and hungry all at the same time. Well, why didn't you say so? Come in. Come in. Daniel stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The apartment was even smaller and more cramped than it had appeared from the hallway. Stacks of old magazines covered the coffee table, their pages dog-eared and stained. The television flickered silently on the wall, its muted images casting an eerie glow on the room. The air felt thick and heavy, laden with the smells of stale food and unwashed laundry. Arya stayed close to him, her small body pressed against his leg like a shadow clinging to the only safe place in the room. Mara forced a smile, her eyes darting nervously. So, you heard her play. She's a natural. I've been telling folks for months that she's got real talent. We've just been waiting for the right opportunity. Daniel looked at Arya, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She played beautifully. Arya's cheeks flushed with pride, her eyes sparkling for a brief moment. Thank you, sir. Mara stepped in front of the girl, effectively blocking her from Daniel's view. So what exactly are you offering? Lessons? A scholarship? Something with your company? Her words came too quickly, too eagerly, tumbling over each other in her haste to secure some kind of advantage. Daniel chose each word carefully, measuring their weight and impact. I want to help Arya. Make sure she has what she needs. Proper training, warmer clothes, a safe environment, support for whatever she wants to pursue. Mara's eyes lit up with a kind of avaricious interest that had nothing to do with Arya's dreams or well-being. Well, all that sounds expensive. Arya looked down, her face flushed with shame once again. I'm sorry. Aunt Mara said we need the money because things are hard. Daniel knelt down so that he could look her directly in the eyes, his gaze gentle but firm. Arya, it is not your job to make money. Not now, not ever. Her lower lip trembled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But she said I had to help. Daniel gently touched her shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. You help by being a child, Arya. By laughing, playing, and learning. By pursuing your music. Before he could say more, a loud knock rattled the door, interrupting their conversation. Mara stiffened, her face tightening with apprehension. Stay here, she hissed at Arya, her voice sharp and warning. Then, she cautiously opened the door, leaving only a narrow crack. A man's voice boomed from the hallway, its tone demanding and impatient. You owe me 300, Mara. You said yesterday. Now you say today. I'm done waiting. Daniel recognized the desperation in the man's voice instantly. He'd grown up surrounded by it, long before he had ascended to the heights of wealth and success. Mara tried to laugh it off, her voice strained and unconvincing. Relax, Tony. I'll have the money soon. The kid's working. She's earning. The man snorted, his disbelief palpable. A 5-year-old? That's your plan? Arya shrank behind Daniel, seeking protection from the harsh words and the looming threat. She huddled against him like a small bird seeking shelter from a storm. Something inside Daniel snapped, a dam of pent-up anger and frustration finally breaking. He stood up slowly, his imposing figure towering behind Mara, casting a long shadow over her. Is there a problem here? The man glared, his eyes narrowed with hostility, but the confidence quickly drained from his face when he took in Daniel's appearance. The expensive coat, the poised stance, the quiet aura of authority that only a successful man carried like a second skin. No problem, the man muttered, his voice losing its edge. I'll come back later. He hurried down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with resentment. Mara slammed the door shut, her face red with anger and embarrassment. She spun around to face Daniel, her eyes blazing. You had no right to interfere. Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice low and controlled. A child is being used to pay your debts. I had every right. Mara's voice rose, her tone harsh and defensive. I feed her. I give her a roof over her head. She owes me. Her mother left me with this mess. Arya flinched at the word mess, her small body recoiling as if she had been struck. Daniel's heart broke cleanly in two, a sharp, searing pain that left him breathless. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm, his gaze unwavering. A child is not a mess, Mara. A child is a responsibility. Mara scoffed, her expression contemptuous. Easy for you to say. You look like someone who's never had to worry about bills or rent or anything real. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. She wasn't entirely right, but she wasn't completely wrong either. He had, in many ways, left the world that Arya inhabited. He had chosen the comfortable path, the path of privilege and ease. And perhaps this was the consequence of that choice, a reckoning he could no longer avoid. He looked at Arya again, her big, soulful eyes, her trembling hands, the faint glimmer of bruised hope clinging to her expression. Something inside him settled with absolute clarity, a profound sense of purpose taking root in his soul. I want to take care of her, he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. Mara's eyes narrowed, her mind racing, her calculating gaze assessing the possibilities. Take care? As in financially? As in making sure she is safe, warm, and treated like a child, not an income source. Mara crossed her arms tightly, her lips pursed in a thin line. If you want that, Daniel, it won't be free. Arya gasped softly, her eyes widening in alarm. Aunt Mara. Daniel stared at the woman, a coldness spreading through him like ice water. You want money to let her be treated like a human being? Mara didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a suffocating miasma, a sour stench of greed and desperation. And Daniel realized then that this wasn't going to be a simple act of rescue. This was going to be a war a battle he had never planned to fight. A war for the heart and soul of a little girl who had already fought too many battles on her own. Mara's living room seemed to shrink by the second, the walls closing in on him, suffocating him. The air was thick with the smell of stale food and cheap cigarette smoke, and beneath it all was something worse, something far more insidious, the heavy, sour scent of fear. Not Daniel's fear, Arya's. She clung to her violin case like it was the only thing that belonged to her, the only tangible symbol of her identity in a world that seemed determined to strip her of everything. Her eyes were wide and darting, flickering between Daniel and Mara, as if she were waiting, bracing herself, to see who would shatter her world next. Mara crossed her arms, leaning against the kitchen counter like a gatekeeper, guarding the only path to Arya's future. "I take care of her," she said, her voice defensive. "I give her a home. What do you have to offer besides pretty words?" Daniel steadied his voice, forcing himself to remain calm despite the rising tide of anger within him. "A safe life, Mara. Warm clothes, nutritious food, a good school, music training, everything she deserves." Mara laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed through the cramped apartment. "Everything she deserves? That's rich, coming from a stranger." Arya tugged at Mara's sleeve, her voice small and pleading. "Aunt Mara, please don't be mad. He's nice." Mara jerked her arm away, her expression hardening. "You hush. Adults are talking." Arya absorbed the words, swallowing them down as she had swallowed every other cruel phrase that had been thrown at her. Quietly, obediently, as if she believed she deserved them. Daniel felt something burn in his chest, a white-hot ember of righteous indignation. Mara continued, her voice rising in pitch. "If you want her to go to those fancy music lessons you brag about, someone has to pay. You think I can afford health insurance, rent, groceries? The girl eats a lot, and the park money is not enough anymore." Daniel stared at her, stunned by the casual cruelty of her words, the blatant exploitation of a child. "She's 5 years old, Mara. She shouldn't be paying anything." Mara shrugged, her expression indifferent. "Then you pay." Her eyes flashed with a cold, calculating glint. "Unless you're all talk." Daniel inhaled slowly, carefully, struggling to maintain his composure. This wasn't negotiation. This was blatant exploitation, a cynical attempt to profit from the vulnerability of a child. And before he could answer, before he could say something he would later regret, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't a pounding, desperate summons like before. It was a smooth, confident knock, the kind of assertive rap that announced the arrival of someone who was accustomed to being in charge. Mara straightened up, brushed her hair back with a quick, nervous gesture, and visibly preened herself. "Oh, that must be him." "Him?" The door swung open, revealing a tall, imposing man in an expensive coat, his presence radiating an aura of power and influence. His smile was sharp, practiced, and carried the polished sheen of someone who was used to selling dreams he would never deliver. Victor Hale. Daniel recognized him instantly. Hale was a notorious music manager, infamous in the industry for packaging child prodigies into profitable brands and discarding them once their viral glow faded. Victor looked at Arya the way a seasoned businessman looks at a valuable antique, his eyes appraising her potential monetary worth. "So, this is the little miracle. You're even younger than the video makes you look." Arya instinctively stepped behind Daniel, seeking refuge from Victor's calculating gaze. Victor chuckled, a dismissive sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "Shy. That's cute. Audiences love shy." Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Why are you here?" Victor raised a brow, his expression mocking. "Daniel Crest, I could ask you the same thing." He turned his attention to Mara, a predatory glint in his eyes. "You didn't tell me her friend was someone with influence." Mara shrugged, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. "I didn't know, but maybe this makes things easier. Maybe we can all work something out, right?" Arya tugged at Daniel's coat, her voice barely audible, her fear palpable. "I don't want to go with him." Victor leaned closer, pretending he hadn't heard her whispered plea. "Look, Mara told me the kid needs opportunities. I can give her a real career. Sponsorships, viral campaigns, brand deals. He smirked, his eyes gleaming with avarice. This girl could pull in more revenue in 6 months than some adults make in 10 years. Daniel felt the room spin, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. So that's what this was all about. Arya wasn't a child to them. She was a product, a commodity to be bought and sold, a means to an end. Victor pulled out a sleek tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen. Here's a preliminary contract. He swiped to a page covered in dense, legal fine print. We own exclusive rights to her performances. She works a set number of hours. We get a share of all earnings. He smiled thinly, his eyes devoid of warmth. Of course, she'll need constant online engagement, daily uploads, live streams, emotional backstories. Maybe something about her being orphaned. Audiences eat that up. Arya flinched, as if the words had physically struck her, the casual cruelty of Victor's proposal cutting deep into her soul. Daniel took a single step forward, placing himself fully between Victor and the girl, shielding her from the predatory gaze of the music manager. She's not signing anything. Victor raised a brow, his expression condescending. And who exactly are you? Her manager? Daniel's voice dropped lower, his tone dangerous. Someone who isn't going to let you use a child to make money. Victor laughed lightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Come on, Daniel. Don't act righteous. You run a music empire. You know how this works. Daniel held his stare, his gaze unwavering. Not with children. Mara stepped between the two men, her eyes darting back and forth, assessing the situation. If he pays, we don't need your contract, right? Her eyes glittered with greed, her mind already calculating the potential financial benefits. Victor scoffed, his lip curling in disdain. You think this corporate saint is going to support her for free? He looked directly at Daniel, his gaze challenging. Let me guess. You want the girl all to yourself. The words struck too close to the truth, sending a shockwave through Daniel. Not because he wanted to own Arya, but because a part of him was beginning to understand why the connection between them felt so deep, so immediate. That thought alone shook him to his core. Victor sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes. Fine. You two fight over her. But Mara, you know how this goes. Kids like her burn out fast. You want to make real money, you call me. He tapped his business card onto the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Opportunities don't wait forever. Then he left as effortlessly as he had arrived, his expensive shoes clicking down the hallway like a warning, a reminder of the cutthroat nature of the music industry. Silence filled the apartment, heavy and oppressive. Mara snatched Victor's card and stuffed it into her pocket. Her eyes narrowed with calculation. He's got a point. I'm the one raising her. I decide what's best. If you want to help, then help with money. Arya's voice cracked, her small body trembling. Aunt Mara, I don't want strangers. I want... She hesitated, her eyes lifting to Daniel, a glimmer of hope flickering within them. I want someone who listens. Daniel knelt beside her, gently taking her small hand in his. Arya, I'm here. I'm not leaving. The little girl blinked, her eyes wide with disbelief, unsure if she dared to trust that sentence, unsure if she dared to believe that someone would actually stay. Mara rolled her eyes, her expression dismissive. Fine. If you're so invested, prove it. She pointed to the door, her voice hard and uncompromising. Take her to your fancy music class or whatever, but she comes back here tonight, and next week you pay rent. And after that, we talk more. Daniel stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze fixed on Mara. We will talk. His voice was calm, but his eyes were steel, a silent promise of things to come. He took Arya's coat, wrapped it gently around her shoulders, and guided her toward the hallway, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment. As they stepped into the dim corridor, Arya looked up at him, her voice small but trembling with a fragile hope. Sir, are you here because Mommy said Daddy would hear the song? Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, the words hitting him like a physical blow, the weight of his past crushing him. Then he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, with a truth he was not yet ready to speak aloud. I heard it, Arya. And I'm not going anywhere. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know at that moment, was that this promise, unlike the one he had made to Lara 6 years ago, would be the one he fought with every breath to keep. The hospital waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale, reheated coffee, a sterile and depressing aroma that did little to soothe Daniel's frayed nerves. A nurse pushed a metal cart past him, the wheels squeaking rhythmically against the linoleum floor, while the soft hum of fluorescent lights pressed against the quiet, amplifying the tension in the air. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, its plaintive wails echoing through the corridors. Someone coughed, a deep, racking sound that spoke of illness and suffering. A vending machine buzzed intermittently in the corner, offering a selection of sugary snacks and lukewarm beverages, a poor substitute for nourishment and comfort. But the loudest sound in Daniel's world was the gasp he had let out an hour earlier, the strangled cry of fear and disbelief that had escaped his lips when Arya had collapsed in the park. It had happened so suddenly, without warning. One moment she was holding his hand, her small fingers intertwined with his, telling him she liked the way the wind made the violin strings hum, creating a haunting melody that danced on the breeze. The next moment, her small face went pale, her eyes rolled back in her head, her knees buckled, and she crumpled into his arms like a discarded paper doll. Hunger, cold, fatigue. A 5-year-old shouldn't know those words as intimately as Arya did. They shouldn't be part of her vocabulary, etched into the lines of her face, reflected in the depths of her eyes. He had carried her into the ambulance himself, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind reeling with panic and fear. He didn't remember the details of the frantic ride to the hospital, just flashes of chaos, the paramedic's calm, reassuring voice, Arya's little fingers going limp in his grasp, her body growing heavy and lifeless in his arms. Now he sat outside her hospital room, his elbows resting on his knees, his head buried in his hands, his body racked with guilt and remorse. He felt as though he had failed her again, that he had not done enough to protect her from the harsh realities of her life. Jenna finally arrived, her face pale and drawn, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Worry was etched across her features, her eyes filled with concern. "Daniel, how is she?" He looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed, his expression haunted. "She fainted, Jenna. They said it was low blood sugar, mild hypothermia. The doctor said she hasn't eaten properly in days." Jenna pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. "Oh, Daniel, that poor baby." A nurse approached them, holding a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Crest, we need the guardian to sign these papers. Does her aunt know she's here?" Daniel paused, hesitating for a moment. He had sent Mara a text message hours ago, informing her of what had happened, but so far, she had not responded. Mara had not shown up at the hospital, had not even bothered to call to inquire about Arya's condition. The nurse frowned, her expression concerned. "We also need to confirm insurance information. Right now, none is listed." Of course, none was listed. Era had lived paycheck to paycheck, barely managing to make ends meet, and Mara hadn't even bothered to bring Arya inside, to provide her with basic necessities. Had she even bothered to ask how the child was doing, if she was all right? A familiar ache burned beneath Daniel's ribs, a sharp, searing pain that spoke of years of regret and unspoken grief. He reached out and took the papers from the nurse's hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'll cover her treatment," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "Send the bill to the Crest Foundation." The nurse's expression softened, her eyes filled with sympathy. "She's lucky to have someone looking out for her." He didn't feel lucky. He felt like a man being forced to confront the consequences of choices he had made years ago. A man who was finally being held accountable for his past actions. Arya stirred in the bed behind the glass window, her small body shifting restlessly beneath the thin hospital blanket. He rose slowly from the uncomfortable plastic chair and walked inside the room, his footsteps muffled by the soft carpet. The room was quiet, except for the gentle, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. A small electronic pulse that measured the beat of Arya's heart, the fragile rhythm of her life. She lay small and still, wrapped in a sterile white hospital blanket, her body dwarfed by the size of the bed. Her hair spread out on the pillow like a dark halo, framing her pale, gaunt face. Her cheeks were unusually pale, and the sprinkling of freckles across her nose stood out more prominently than usual, a stark contrast against her ashen skin. A child shouldn't look that fragile, Daniel thought, his heart aching with a profound sense of tenderness. A child should be vibrant and full of life, not lying still and vulnerable in a hospital bed. He sat down on the chair beside her bed and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead, his touch light and feather-soft. "You're safe, little one," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm right here." Her eyelids fluttered, and she stirred slightly, her eyes struggling to focus. She whispered a single word, her voice faint and barely audible. "Mommy." Daniel froze, his heart seizing in his chest. Arya's fingers searched blindly for someone to hold, her small hand groping for comfort and reassurance. He reached out and took her hand in both of his grip gentle but firm, offering her a sense of stability and security. "I'm here, Arya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rest now." She drifted back into sleep, her breathing becoming slow and steady, trusting him more than he deserved, placing her faith in him despite the fact that he had been absent for so long. He stayed like that for a long while, his hand wrapped around hers, his heart unraveling piece by piece, the threads of his past and present tangling together in a complex and painful knot. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in muted shades of gray, there was a sharp rattle outside the door, followed by the sound of someone barging into the room. Mara burst into the room, her hair messy and unkempt, her jacket thrown haphazardly over her pajamas, her eyes blazing with anger. "What did you do?" she snapped, her voice shrill and accusatory. "Dragging her to a hospital, signing things in my place, making me look irresponsible." Daniel didn't rise from the chair, his expression calm and controlled despite the turmoil raging within him. "You weren't here, Mara." Arya fainted. She rolled her eyes, her expression dismissive. "Kids faint all the time. She just works too hard." Daniel stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, his gaze locking onto Mara's. "She is 5 years old, Mara. She shouldn't have to work at all." Mara waved her hand dismissively, her eyes narrowing. "Spare me the speech. You want to help? Fine. But you don't get to judge me." She looked around the room, her gaze taking in the various pieces of hospital equipment, her expression calculating. "What is all this going to cost?" Daniel felt a wave of heat rising within him, but it wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something more visceral, a raw and primal emotion that stemmed from a place of profound love and protectiveness. "Arya needs a stable environment, Mara. Food, care, warmth. She needs to live like a child. Not like a burden," Mara snapped, finishing his sentence for him, her voice laced with bitterness. "Because that's what she is, Daniel. A burden. Her mother left her with me without a dime. You think I asked for any of this?" The name hung in the air between them like a ghost, a haunting reminder of the past. Era. Daniel turned away, his heart pounding in his chest, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Mara noticed the shift in his demeanor, the subtle change in his expression, and a knowing smirk spread across her face. "Yeah, she's gone. Died last month. Been sick for a long time. Left nothing but trouble behind." He clenched his jaw, his fists clenching at his sides, struggling to maintain his composure. "Era didn't leave trouble, Mara. She left a child." A laugh escaped Mara's lips, a bitter, sharp sound that echoed through the room. "Oh, she left something else, too." She pointed toward a duffel bag sitting in the corner, its contents spilling out onto the floor. "Her precious box. Always said it was for the kid when the time was right. I didn't care. I just tossed it in with her things." Daniel walked toward the bag in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. "A box?" Mara shrugged, her expression indifferent. "Some old wooden thing. Probably just junk." He found it. A small wooden box, intricately etched with tiny musical notes and worn fingerprints. It was the kind of box that a musician would keep their most sacred memories in, the kind of box that held secrets and dreams. His breath hitched in his throat, and his hands began to shake uncontrollably. He had seen this box before 6 years ago in Era's hands. She always said she would fill it with things worth remembering, things that would last a lifetime. His hands trembled as he opened it, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and soft at the edges, worn smooth with age. A letter. The moment he saw the handwriting, the world seemed to stop spinning. It was Era's handwriting, instantly recognizable, her elegant script filling the page. He unfolded the letter slowly, carefully, as though each crease might break him, might shatter the fragile illusion of hope that had begun to take root in his heart. "My dearest Daniel," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means our daughter has found her way to you. Her name is Arya. She carries your love for music and your fire for life. Please take care of her when I no longer can." Daniel swayed, his knees weakening. The room blurred around him, the sounds of the hospital fading into a distant buzz. He barely heard Mara mutter something about the box, about how it had been sitting there forever, about how she never understood what the big deal was. But Daniel wasn't listening. Arya, their daughter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending him reeling. Their daughter, a truth he had never dared to imagine, now so undeniable, so irrevocably real, that it shook the ground beneath him. Everything he had pushed away, the love, the choice, the leaving, came crashing back with the force of 5 lost years, a tidal wave of regret and remorse threatening to drown him. Arya shifted in her sleep, her small fingers curling slightly toward him, as if she sensed his presence, as if she knew that he was finally there, that he had finally come home. And with tears stinging his eyes, Daniel finally understood the truth he had been running from, the truth that had been staring him in the face all along, the melody that had found him in the park, the haunting tune that had stirred something deep within his soul, the promise he had broken 6 years ago, the promise he had made to Lara, the promise he had failed to keep. The little girl searching for her father, her voice calling out in the darkness, her heart yearning for connection. They were all the same story, all interconnected, all leading him back to this moment. His story. And it was time, far past time, to finish it. Morning light filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, casting pale, tired shadows across the room. It was the kind of winter sunlight that never quite warmed the skin, a feeble attempt to chase away the lingering darkness. Daniel stood at the window of Arya's room, holding Alara's letter in both hands, his fingers tracing the delicate script, his eyes scanning the words over and over again. He had read it a dozen times through the night, memorizing every word, every sentence, as if it might disappear if he blinked. Arya slept quietly, her small breaths rising and falling in steady, reassuring waves. Their daughter, his daughter, a truth he had never dared to imagine, now so undeniable. It shook the ground beneath him, rewriting the narrative of his life. But the world outside that quiet room wasn't waiting. The clock was ticking, and the gears of the music industry were already turning. The news of Arya's existence had already begun to ripple through the media, creating a buzz of excitement and speculation. A mysterious child violinist, a viral park performance, a connection to the powerful CEO of Crest Music Group. Opportunists smelled opportunity, predators smelled profit, and the vultures were already circling, eager to exploit Arya's talent and her newfound notoriety. By the time Daniel stepped into his office later that morning, chaos was waiting for him. The vultures had already begun to circle, sensing blood. His assistant, Jenna, hurried toward him, her face pale and anxious. "Daniel, the board wants an emergency meeting. Victor Hale has been sending emails. Reporters are calling." And she hesitated, her voice laced with concern. "This morning, the stock dipped 2 points. We need to get ahead of this story, contain the damage before it explodes into a full-blown crisis." Ms. Green, another board member, voiced her displeasure quite sharply. "But I think we can spin this. PR play. A charity angle, perhaps? A narrative of a powerful CEO reaching out to help an orphan prodigy. Heartwarming, utterly marketable. Think of the brand partnerships. This could be huge. especially with our insurance sponsors and that credit card co-branding deal slated for next quarter. Daniel's stare turned glacial. She is not a story, he said, each word clipped and precise. She is my daughter. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Even Jenna, standing near the wall, gasped softly, though deep down, she'd already suspected the truth. Carver blinked, genuinely dumbfounded. Your daughter? Daniel nodded once, a single, decisive movement. Yes. He felt no shame, only a fierce protectiveness rising within him. She is my child, and she is mine. A dozen voices erupted simultaneously, a cacophony of panic, outrage, and shock. This could be a scandal. Partnerships are at risk. This will jeopardize our quarterly projections. Daniel rose from his seat, placing his palms flat on the polished mahogany table. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet. That child has been starving. She fainted in a public park. Her guardian is exploiting her talent, and all you care about is quarterly projections? His voice cracked through the room like a bolt of lightning. Ms. Green attempted to interject, but Daniel cut her off with a sharp gesture. If anyone in this company attempts to leverage Arya for PR, for branding, for marketing, or for profit in any form, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. You will be out of this building before sunrise. I guarantee it. Carver flushed crimson with anger. You think you can threaten us? Daniel, you may be CEO, but you answer to this board. We can vote you out. Daniel didn't flinch, his expression unwavering. Then vote. But I will not stand by and allow you to exploit a 5-year-old child. Not my child. Not any child. Silence. Heavy. Charged. And then, a slow, deliberate clap echoed from the doorway. Victor Hale. He sauntered into the room with that trademark slick smile, the kind that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Impressive speech, Daniel. Truly. But you and I both know that children like her burn bright, but they burn fast. Audiences love tragedy. They adore a sad backstory. Think of the revenue. Concerts, streaming, merchandising. This girl is a gold mine. Why pretend otherwise? Daniel took a step toward him, his fists clenched. Get out. Victor merely smirked, unfazed. Not without an offer. He held up a contract, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Exclusive rights to Arya's performances. We launch her as a cresting musical phenomenon. You become the heroic father who rediscovered his prodigy daughter. Everybody wins. Daniel reached out, snatched the contract from his hand, and tore it clean in half. The sound reverberated in the tense air. Victor's smile finally cracked, revealing the hard edges beneath. You're making a mistake, Daniel. Daniel's voice dropped low, steady, and dangerous. No, Victor. You made the mistake the moment you looked at my daughter and saw profit instead of a human being. Victor's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. You think you've won? You haven't. People like me, we always find a way. But an unfamiliar voice cut through the tension, clear and resolute. No, you don't. Jenna stepped forward, holding a thick folder, her expression determined. These are reports from every artist you signed under the age of 18. Every unfair contract, every exploitative clause. And the legal team confirmed this morning that your company is under investigation. Victor's face drained of color, the bravado vanishing like smoke. Daniel spoke quietly, each word laced with steel. You're done here. Victor backed toward the door, his anger twisting his features into something ugly and grotesque. But beneath the anger, something else flickered. A fleeting and unexpected expression, shame. A small spark, but undeniably real. He left the room without another word. Carver cleared his throat awkwardly, attempting to regain control. This complicates things. Daniel looked at every person in the room, his gaze unwavering. Arya stays with me permanently. I am filing for guardianship today. Anyone who tries to stand in my way, anyone who attempts to control this narrative, will face me directly. No one argued. Beneath his calm demeanor, they heard the resolve of a man who had spent 6 years burying a broken heart, and who was finished burying anything, or anyone, ever again. Later that day, Daniel returned to the hospital, pacing the hallway outside Arya's room, anxiety churning in his stomach. When he finally opened the door, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes, a fragile smile gracing her lips. "Sir," she whispered, "you came back again." He knelt beside her bed, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, Arya. Not ever again." She reached for his hand, her small hand, the same hand that had held a violin in the cold, the same hand that had played a melody meant for him. In that moment, her fingers curled around his, and he knew he had finally come home to the promise he had once broken. The night of the concert arrived with a soft winter breeze whispering through the city, a gentle reminder that some evenings are destined to change lives. Snow had fallen earlier, thin and powdery, dusting the streets with a delicate white glow. Downtown lights shimmered against the pavement, and the Grand Theater stood proudly among them. Tall marble columns, warm golden lamps, and banners hung high with delicate lettering. A tribute to Era Rivers, a night of music for children in need. Daniel stood backstage, meticulously adjusting the cuffs of his impeccably tailored black suit. It had been years since he'd worn anything like this for a concert, years since he had stood in the wings of a stage with a violin waiting for him, beckoning him back to a version of himself he had buried deep beneath layers of contracts, numbers, and board meetings. He exhaled slowly, staring at his reflection in the dressing room mirror, searching for a trace of the man he used to be. The last time he had prepared for a performance like this, Era had been beside him, laughing, tuning her violin, bumping his shoulder playfully when he took himself too seriously. But tonight, the person he was waiting for wasn't Era. It was their daughter. Behind him, tiny footsteps shuffled hesitantly. He turned. Arya stood in the doorway wearing a simple white dress chosen by Jenna hours earlier. Simple, soft, nothing flashy or heavy, just comfortable fabric that made her look like the child she was meant to be. Her dark hair had been brushed gently, tied back with a small ribbon. Someone from the staff had warmed her cheeks with a little moisturizer, so she wouldn't look pale beneath the harsh stage lights. But even with all that, Arya looked nervous, almost fragile. She clutched her violin close to her chest like a shield. Daniel stepped toward her slowly, his movements deliberate and reassuring. "Hey, little one." She fiddled with the bow, her voice barely a whisper. "Sir, what if I play the wrong note? What if the people out there get mad?" Daniel knelt until he was level with her eyes, meeting her gaze with unwavering sincerity. Those same eyes Era had once looked at him with when she asked if he would choose love over ambition. "Arya," he said gently, his voice filled with warmth and reassurance. "If you play wrong notes, I'll still be right next to you. If you forget a part, I'll help you find it again. If the world outside gets loud or confusing, you can look at me and we'll play together. You're not alone. Not tonight. Not ever again." Her lip trembled, but for the first time since he had met her, it wasn't from fear. It was from relief. "Do you promise?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He placed a hand over his heart, his eyes locked on hers. "With everything I am." She leaned forward timidly at first, then wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck. Daniel closed his eyes, letting her tiny heartbeat press against him. This embrace felt like a missing piece sliding perfectly into place after 6 long, agonizing years. A stagehand poked his head into the hallway. "Mr. Crest, 5 minutes." Daniel nodded and looked down at Arya, his expression soft. "Ready?" She inhaled deeply, nodding back, her gaze determined. "Mommy would want me to be brave." "Yes," Daniel whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She would." As they walked toward the stage entrance, the low murmur of the audience washed over them, hundreds of people filling the theater. Donors, musicians, news reporters, curious music lovers, and strangers who had watched Arya's short park video online and felt something in their hearts shift. In one of the back rows, hidden beneath a heavy wool coat, Mara sat alone, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't said a word since the hospital. She hadn't yelled, hadn't bargained, hadn't demanded a thing. She just sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the stage with a strange mix of guilt, longing, and exhaustion. Maybe for the first time in her life she wasn't thinking about debts or money. Maybe she was finally seeing the child she had failed, not the burden she had convinced herself she was carrying. Daniel led Arya to a small waiting area near the stage curtain. The orchestra finished tuning. Violins hummed softly. A flute whispered a scale. A cellist adjusted his bow with the careful attention of someone preparing for something sacred. A spotlight began to glow on the center of the stage. The conductor walked out to polite applause. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor the extraordinary spirit of Era Rivers, a musician who believed that music could find anyone, anywhere, even in the darkest moments of life. Daniel felt Arya's hand squeeze his. She whispered, her voice filled with awe, "That's Mommy's name." He nodded, his voice warm and steady. "Yes, sweetheart, and tonight is for her." The conductor continued, his voice resonating through the theater. "Tonight we also celebrate a new voice in the musical world. A small girl with a big heart whose courage reminded us that music is a bridge between souls. Please welcome Arya." Arya's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I'll be right behind you," he whispered, his voice filled with encouragement. "Go on, little one." He placed a gentle hand on her back, guiding her forward. She stepped out onto the stage. The audience gasped, not from spectacle or drama, but from the sight of a tiny child standing under a warm golden light, clutching a violin with trembling hands. A gentle applause rose, soft and respectful, as if people were acknowledging something rare and pure. Arya walked to the center of the stage. Daniel followed, his own violin in hand. The conductor lowered his baton. Silence fell like a blanket over the room, expectant and profound. Daniel knelt beside Arya, whispering one last thing. "Play the way your mother taught you, not for them but for her." Arya nodded, her small body shaking slightly. Then she lifted her bow. The first note floated out, fragile, trembling, but achingly beautiful. A sound that seemed too full of longing to have come from such tiny hands. And when Daniel raised his own violin to join her, the room seemed to exhale, releasing the collective breath it had been holding. Two melodies, one small and searching, one deeper and aching with years of silence, braided together in the air, weaving a tapestry of sound that transcended words. Father and daughter, for the first time, playing the melody that once lived only between Daniel and Era. Every note carried a piece of their truth: regret, forgiveness, reunion, love. And in the audience, even the most hardened hearts softened, touched by the raw emotion that poured from the stage. When the last note faded, Arya lowered her bow slowly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She turned toward Daniel, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Did I do okay?" He smiled, a real, full smile he hadn't felt in years, the kind that reached his eyes and warmed his soul. "You were perfect." And as the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause, Arya didn't look at them. She looked at him, because finally, after 5 years of waiting, her father had found her. When the applause finally settled into a warm hush, the lights softened, dimming into a gentle amber glow. Arya stood on the stage clutching her violin, her chest rising and falling with quick, nervous breaths. But Daniel was right beside her, one hand resting lightly on her back, steadying her like the anchor she had never had before. The conductor stepped forward, offering them both a quiet nod of respect, the kind that musicians give when they recognize that something sacred has just been shared. Then Arya whispered, barely loud enough for Daniel to hear, Daddy, are you still here?" The word daddy fell from her lips like a fragile leaf drifting to the ground, a word he thought he would never hear. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He lowered himself onto one knee so she wouldn't have to look up so far to see him, his gaze filled with love and tenderness. "I'm here, Arya, and I'm not going anywhere again." Her shoulders shook, relief crashing through her tiny body like a wave that had been held back for too long. Arya threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. The audience watched in utter silence, as if afraid a single breath might disturb this reunion 5 years overdue. Daniel held her tightly with both arms, his eyes closing against the sting of tears he had kept buried for too many years. This time he didn't run from emotion. This time he didn't choose ambition over love. This time he stayed. A soft gasp rose from the crowd. At the back of the theater, Mara stood slowly, hesitantly. Her hands trembled at her sides. She watched the little girl she had failed, not because she was born cruel, but because life had carved so much hardness into her that she had forgotten gentleness was even an option. Arya saw the movement and turned her head. "Aunt Mara," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Daniel followed her gaze. Mara's chin quivered, her face etched with pain. Her voice cracked through the quiet, filled with remorse. "Arya, She swallowed hard, something bitter and broken rising in her throat. "I'm so sorry." Arya blinked, unsure, frightened, and hopeful all at once. Mara took a shaky step forward. "I was wrong. I was angry and tired and scared. I let all the wrong things take over." Her voice faltered. "And I hurt you because of it." Daniel didn't say anything. He let Arya choose how to respond, because despite everything she had been through, she still had the softest heart he had ever seen. Arya took a tiny step toward her aunt, her small hand outstretched. "Aunt Mara, Mommy said people make mistakes," she said. "Mistakes don't mean they're bad forever." Mara broke completely. Tears slid down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with the regret she had never allowed herself to feel. "I don't deserve forgiveness, honey." Arya wiped her own tears with the back of her hand and whispered, her voice filled with unexpected wisdom. "Then make yourself someone who does." Even Daniel felt his breath catch at the depth of wisdom those soft words carried. Era had taught her daughter well. Mara nodded, weeping, her heart breaking with the realization of her failures. "I'll try." Daniel placed a gentle hand on Arya's shoulder, his gaze softening as he looked at Mara. "You won't do it alone," he said, not unkindly. "But Arya lives with me now. She has a home, a real one." He looked down at his daughter, his eyes filled with love. "And she will always know stability and love." Mara nodded again, smaller, quieter, and stepped back into the shadowed aisle, no longer a threat, but a woman beginning the long, arduous journey toward change and redemption. The conductor cleared his throat softly and signaled to the orchestra. "One more piece," he whispered. "In memory of Era." Daniel lifted Arya's violin again, and together, father and daughter, played the gentle closing theme her mother used to hum when the world felt too heavy, the melody that had always brought them solace. The music rose like a prayer, tender, trembling, full of light, filling the theater with a palpable sense of hope and healing. Somewhere in the rafters, or perhaps somewhere far beyond them, Era's memory lingered in the air, warm and proud, watching over her family. When the final note faded, the theater fell completely silent, a silence filled with reverence and respect. Then slowly, almost reverently, the audience stood, not for a performance, not for a CEO, not for a prodigy, but for a family that had found each other through the only thing that never lied: music. Arya looked up at Daniel, her eyes shining with joy and gratitude, and whispered, "Daddy, the song found you." And Daniel answered, his voice thick with emotion, "It always would, sweetheart. It always would." Later that night, long after the applause had faded, after the lights had dimmed, after the stagehands had packed their equipment, and after the last audience member had shuffled out into the cold, Daniel and Arya stepped out onto the quiet, snow-covered street. Snow had begun to fall again, the soft flakes landing on Arya's hair, on her eyelashes, melting into tiny diamonds. Daniel scooped her up into his arms, holding her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, her violin case dangling from her small hand. "Where are we going now?" she murmured sleepily, her voice barely audible. "Home," Daniel said, the word tasting right now, feeling right for the first time in years. Not just like a place, like a promise. As they walked through the silent, snow-dusted streets, Arya whispered, her voice soft and filled with wonder, "Daddy, do you think Mommy heard us?" Daniel looked up at the winter sky, wide, endless, and shimmering with a million stars. "I think she heard every note." Arya smiled against his coat, her heart filled with peace and contentment. "Then she's not lonely." "Neither are you," he whispered, his arms tightening around her protectively. And so, under a quiet snowfall and a sky full of soft winter stars, a little girl who once played alone in the cold finally found the arms meant to hold her, the warmth she had longed for her entire life. A father who once chose ambition finally chose love, realizing that the greatest success was not found in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the unconditional love he shared with his daughter. And a promise written 6 years ago in a tiny room with fairy lights finally came home to the place it always belonged, sealing a bond that could never be broken. This story reminds us that some melodies never disappear. Even when we think we've lost them, they wait patiently in the corners of our lives, drifting through time, through memory, through regret, until the moment we are brave enough to listen again, to open our hearts to the music that connects us all. If this story touched your heart tonight, stay close to Inspire Moments, a community dedicated to sharing stories that heal, that soften, that remind us we are all searching for someone or something to guide us home, to lead us back to love. And if you feel someone out there needs a little warmth, a little hope, a little music in their lives, share this moment with them. You never know whose life it might reach, whose heart it might touch, whose journey it might illuminate. Good night, dear friends. Until our next shared moment, may your nights be filled with peace, and may your lives be filled with the music of love and connection.